For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 44, our preview coverage of Paris NASH and the NAFLD Summit starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
We need to do a better job of patient stratification. And it begs the question, are there different biomarkers? Are there different measurements that need to be correlated to each of these patients? So I don't think of it as personalized medicine, but rather more intentional.
If I reflect a little bit about the field, I've heard discussions with colleagues that, we're too subspecialized. And if you're only focused on the liver, you're going to miss a lot of the aspects that the patients with NASH are troubled by, or even maybe endocrinologists are a step further here because they look at different organ systems, but still their concept of liver disease, I think at this time is not to the level where it could be. So there's been some talks about you need physicians to address metabolic health in a broader sense, and that's like a physician's administrative discussion. There's no global metabolist, if you'd like.
The way to appreciate the importance of fatty liver disease is to understand how many metabolic diseases and deaths it contributes to and how directly you can draw those links, because the more you can draw those links and the more directly, the lower a standard I suspect you wind up having for proving things about the liver itself, because it's going to flow out in a bunch of different directions.
We don't try and repair a car without opening the bonnet to look at the engine, but we're trying to solve diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all of the other linked metabolic diseases without taking the lid off the liver. Can we now get everybody in and around as engineers looking at this engine? Because it's all part and parcel. The car doesn't work uniformly, neither do we.
We're not asking to be on the cover here, but we're asking that when you talk about non-communicable diseases, you mention one of the most prevalent ones in the world, which is fatty liver disease. I don't think you're delivering on diabetes and cardiovascular and cancer, cardiovascular disease, if you're not addressing the liver as well. I think you're doing your patients more than a disservice. This is completely unethical to not be talking about what the impact is on the liver.
Over the next 2 weeks, leaders of industry and academia will gather, first in Paris, for the 8th annual Paris NASH Meeting, and then in Dublin, for the NAFLD Summit. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, along with this week's guests, health systems researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jeff Lazarus, and scientist and entrepreneur Rachel Zayas, as they anticipate highlights from these 2 upcoming conferences, right now, on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Hi, it's Roger. As I get started, I want to acknowledge that this week is going to be a little different than the typical episode. For one thing, we attempted to combine 2 separate but related topics into a single episode. For another, the we is figurative, because neither Louise nor Jörn will play a role in our coverage of the NAFLD Summit, and as a result, the back end of our episode. And finally, because we admittedly pulled all this together late, we're not giving the NAFLD Summit the preview it deserves, given what a fantastic event it will be. At any rate, here's the plan for today. The largest part of this episode will be a preview of Paris NASH with Jörn, Louise, our good friend Rachel Zayas, and me, going over what we think are going to be the high points of that fantastic meeting. The second shorter piece will be an interview with Jeff Lazarus and me, focusing in one part on what Jeff's been doing for the last few months and an equal part on what he and I anticipate will be some of the highlights coming from the NAFLD Summit. That will be today's episode. Comment from our voiceover assistant Grace will separate the 2 sections, and the business section will come at the back end. Hope you enjoy it. And with that, why don't we go straight to groundbreakers? Rachel, Louise, Jörn, brave one, go first. One good thing, personal, professional, happened in the last week.
I'll jump right in. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. On Monday, my team that has been working for 4 years to get to this point had a readout on our pilot study. So we have data for our pilot study that can differentiate simple steatosis from NASH from a blood draw. And I'm really excited about this. It's been years in the making, and we have some concrete evidence that our tools are functional, accurate, and it's going to move us forward as a company and hopefully as an industry as well. So that's my big news to share.
That's great news.
Fantastic.
That's fantastic.
Congratulations.
We were proud to know you already, but this might rise to a whole new level. Okay.
We'll see. We'll see if this can hold up in a larger sample size, one step at a time.
That was why I said might. I didn't want to put the cart before the squadron of horses.
Little baby steps.
All right. Louise or Jörn, go ahead.
I suppose I'll jump in next. I got information that confirmed that I'd passed my nutrition course, which was a year of hard work and various modules. And it does not mean I am a fully qualified nutritionist. It means I know an awful lot more than I did before. And have some level of achievement, which is great news for me, and hopefully it gives me better understanding of a lot of the pathways and what happens and how I can explain it. So it's just about my knowledge and using it better, because we don't get too much within nursing in the background on nutrition per se.
So this is a lot of achievement to measure up to. And I've got nothing.
Yeah, I don't think I can live up to Rachel's or Louise's highlights. And as a matter of fact, I think we just recorded a couple of days ago, Roger. So let me think what has happened. I feel the weather has become much more pleasant, but I don't want to talk about the weather. So I picked my 7-year up today from sports camp. It's her second last day of sports camp. We're still in the summer school holiday break here. It was my pleasure to pick her up today. It's just very proud and exciting to see her running with all the kids and having fun there. So they had an Olympiad today. They said, I haven't quite figured out what they did yet, but they had a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. So this is the first week of school here. My granddaughter had her first day ever of school yesterday. I wasn't able to be there, but the pictures are amazing. And actually, I will talk a little bit about the weather, because this will be Labor Day weekend, and all over the world, we'll have seasons in transition. Given how miserably hot the summer was in so many places, I'm kind of hoping that some people get relief. The eastern U.S., I think, was relatively spared compared to where Jörn is or where Louise is, or the Western U.S., and praying for those people in Pakistan who are just in China, who in different ways are having such a terrible time right now. But hopefully the change in seasons will presage better for everybody. With that, what we're going to do is we're going to take about the next 30 to 40 minutes and run through a preview of Paris NASH and the things that interest each of us. Since we've got about half an episode to do this, instead of going item by item all the way through, what I'd like to start by asking each of the four of us one specific thing going on in this meeting that we're particularly excited to get to hear, see, learn. Again, brave one, go first.
So one thing that stuck out on the programming to me is a talk called Controversy: Are HIV-infected patients more at risk of NASH? And this was a topic of discussion in some previous conferences at ILC. And I found this really interesting because previously it was found that through analyses using FAST, which is FibroScan, liver stiffness measurements, CAP plus AST, in a cohort of about 1,500 patients, the prevalence of NAFLD, NASH, and then fibrosis was higher in HIV patients compared to the general population. And this is really interesting for various reasons. So it alludes to the idea that we need to do a better job of patient stratification. And it begs the question, are there different biomarkers? Are there different measurements that need to be correlated to each of these patients? So I don't think of it as personalized medicine, but rather more intentional. So I think the field is moving in that direction. I'm really interested to see the highlights of this talk.
So Rachel, I love your distinction between personalized and intentional medicine. I think that's a realistic way to frame what a lot of people overpromise. I think that's great.
Yeah, because I think that there's some negative connotation with personalized medicine, because then it's just 1 out of 7 or 8 billion. It's not one. It's a group of patients that we've overlooked, and not just with HIV patients, but being very intentional with stratification and determining if the biomarkers have a similar clinical efficacy between these patients. So it seems to be this narrative is moving in that direction, and I'm excited to see this.
There's some interesting aspects, if I cut in, Roger, to HIV populations. Typically, they're under continued medical care at specialized centers, so they show up for their appointments repeatedly, and there's a lot of opportunity to see them and follow them more closely than, let's say, a patient that's not receiving HIV medicine and like a NASH patient. So I think the follow-up is much more complete, and probably the phenotyping too. We've gathered some information ourselves. There's some risk factors that accumulate in those patients. I mean, it used to be the drugs, HIV itself, as steatotic, and interesting to me is always typically it's a male overrepresentation in HIV cohorts. And of course, they're younger. On the other hand, there's a big group that really is very focused on fitness and physical expression. And such, I'm always struck by the fact that they accumulate metabolic risk factors to the same extent as it does the general population. And I do like those. We've actually published some data that reflects that. And just to stay in that session, because the whole session, that's session 2 in the program, is called Clinical Aspect. And I think there are 2 more exciting talks. Cyril Kasi discussing type 2 diabetes subpopulations. And the endocrinology literature, there's certain, based on the insulin resistance, there's subclassifications of patients with type 2 diabetes that develop different outcomes. So I'll be very excited to see if she sticks to that. There are certain patients get more cardiovascular, more renal, or more liver endpoints. It will be interesting to see if she follows that distinction, if we can learn something about which type 2 diabetes patient is more severely liver diseased. And then, of course, Chris Cowley, who has a tremendous oversight in the field and has been around for a long time to really give a great talk on all these cohort studies and placebo arms, natural history and outcomes. So I think session 2, clearly, if you're a clinician, is something to be excited for.
Given that that's the same session that Rachel pointed out, the third paper being the HIV, that feels like a significantly can't-miss session for everyone. Okay, so Louise, why don't you pick one next, and then I will, and then we'll go back through the program.
I think it's the first day, and the first morning is key. I quite like the idea of session 1. I love the HIV one, but I'm certainly not going to comment on that now. But Maud was one of my consultants at Imperial, so I have a lovely interest to watch some of the work coming out of that team. So that's fantastic. But I was looking at the integration of liver under cardiometabolic health, Zenand from France, in the aspect that, as we know, that the majority of people with poor liver health won't get liver disease. The majority of those with NAFLD don't get NASH. So who do we take? Do we actually look at the cardiometabolic or diabetes? I think there's a session later on in the meeting on endocrine as well. But I think that coupled with session 5 on the following day, which is NASH Pass, which is a 3 years of data and experiences in metabolic disease-focused patient registry and biobank supporting biomarker and drug development research with Marcus Hompesch from the USA. So I think those 2 interested me, obviously, because we're now moving more cardiometabolically, and I'd like to see some of the data and the experiences that those patients have within that cohort and how it can support. That's where we're going to find the breadth and depth of patients for future NASH studies, is in that cardiometabolic or metabolic profiling. If we want to move the industry forward quicker, we need to recruit large numbers to clinical trials over the next 3 to 5 years, probably. And that's where I was looking for, because they interested me in the sessions.
So maybe this is recency effect and that I edit all our episodes and things like that. But on Monday, most recent episode, Mazen Noureddin used a phrase I'd not heard before to describe the future of NASH therapy. He described it as combo, by which he meant we'll be using combination NITs to figure out what's going on and then combination drugs to treat it. So I was intrigued to take a look at the hour from 2:30 to 3:30 on Friday, which starts with a 30-minute talk from Arun Sanyal about the current status and future directions of NIT-based drug development and clinical management, which is, I perceive, going to be a combo discussion, virtually has to be. And then followed by Frank Anania from the FDA talking about how to approach combination therapies in NASH. And one of the things that emerged from our discussion on Monday was about the importance of dosing and benefits of lower dosing when you get to combination therapy. That's followed by a 15-minute talk from Roy Sabo in the U.S. about response adaptive trial design to pick the appropriate dose. So I kind of felt like you take that hour, and if you listen to everything we were talking about on Monday, that hour points to a lot of where we think where that episode would suggest the future goes in a very practical, commercial kind of way. There are a couple of things that scientifically intrigued me as well, but we'll just stop there for the moment. Comments or thoughts about that one or that hour?
Yeah, in that one, and what you said, some of the aspects reminded me of a discussion we had with Stephen Harrison here the other day, the response adaptive trial design to pick the best dose. But it'd be very interesting to also pick the best qualifying biomarker to increase your patient recruitment and decrease screen failure. So I think when you're setting up your clinical trial, you should consider to have an NIT package that you think will select and decrease your screen failure rate. And you should be able to maybe use that adaptively and based on the enrollment in your clinical trial, because this might be influenced by how the investigators perceive your drug and which patients stay screened. So I think that would be something also. I'm not sure that's covered here, but it kind of goes down the same pipeline of the discussion that we had.
Yeah, agree with that. And it's worth noting in that context that this is the same day that Madrigal put out its press release on the outcome-based resmetirom trial, which will have no biopsies in it and will be driven by outcomes on the one end and NITs on the other end. So all these things start to circle towards a specific and very exciting, I think, kind of future.
What I did like about the whole program actually is the fact that it is very metabolic and multi-organ focused. It is not just one organ-centric NASH program, which is a beautiful thing as we move more into a metabolic consideration, I suppose, with the guidelines, looking at type 2 diabetes and other diseases. So that's what I'm encouraged to see, and I think that's where we're heading, is this more multi-system coordinated approach. And some of the speakers I've never heard of, which is always great to see, because it's always nice to hear new people come in that certainly that I've not been aware of, and I'm not aware of a lot of them, but certainly getting other people's opinions. And there's a few patients there. There's a beautiful session at the end of the meeting with experiences from around the world, from South Africa, from other areas. So that'll be exciting to listen to.
Echo that, Louise. And I think we should congratulate Lauren Safarti and Arun Sunyal for putting this together. I always find it's a very deliberate program with a lot of different topics that are being expressed. And as such, it's worth to stay for the full meeting.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I'm also with Louise. I love the idea that at the end of basically 2 days of discussion from a variety of different perspectives, some scientific, some very patient-focused and practical, that what we wind up with is advocates and visionaries from different parts of the world answering the question, here's what all this means in the context of where we are. Jörn, I kind of found that in the spirit of the Barcelona meeting, to focus on pathways, the practicalities of pathways, and the ways that those implications will vary from region to region. So I loved that as a close for it.
I agree. And maybe the Barcelona meeting has inspired them, but for sure, this is one very important way to respect when moving forward the different views. And they've invited me to give the European view as much as I can give that. The answer is going to be different in different countries. And as such, I'm going to be very excited to hear, what's the South African voice, what's the Asian voice, the Latin American voice there. And I think we can learn from each other. I mean, there's always specificities to the specific health systems and limitations and access, some inequalities, but at a broader sense, we're all trying to overcome them. And I think that last session will highlight some of the tools to do so.
I think the biggest thing that differentiates this meeting for me from Barcelona is the fact that was pathway focused. And how do we develop pathways? And there was a lot of discussion in the room. There's no pathway discussions on this meeting in that sense. Neither are there any allied health or nursing at the table. So again, that would be a weakness for me, because I think there is a view from our side and colleagues from across the allied health spectrum into this, but it is more focused on industry and clinical trials and research, and I can understand why there is no allied health in there or nutrition from those aspects.
Although that said, I was delighted that the view from the U.S. coming right before Jörn is going to come from Jeff McIntyre from GLI, who in fact has strong policy chops, worked in the Obama White House at one point, patient advocacy chops, and some pretty good science skills, and is articulate and fast on his feet, and I'm a big fan, but not a physician. So not allied health professional, notedly, but not a physician or researcher perspective necessarily either, which I think is a good thing. Maybe what we should do with the next 15, 20 minutes is go back through, start at the first session, and comment on anything that we didn't mention so far that we think might be of interest. So the first morning starts with a section called Epidemiology and Public Health. Louise, you've commented on two of the presentations in this section, I guess, Patient Journey with NASH one, and then the Integrating Liver under Cardiometabolic Health. I'm intrigued by the third one in the context of what you just said. I don't know anything about oxynodropkina, I have to admit, but I don't know how you train the next generation of providers about metabolic health if you focus solely on physicians.
I think you don't. I think that's the opportunity, is that you include allied health and you make it all round. A lot of physicians don't get nutritional input into their course. There's lots of things that could be done within metabolic health. And I agree with you. That was an interesting one. It's the first person from Russia I've seen at any of the conferences. So does this mean that the world is opening up again? So it struck me as interesting from lots of different perspectives.
Yeah, she's a cardiologist and she's been working on preventive strategies a lot. So her view is going to be very interesting. If I reflect a little bit about the field, I've heard discussions with colleagues that, we're too subspecialized. And if you're only focused on the liver, you're going to miss a lot of the aspects that the patients with NASH are troubled by, or even maybe endocrinology endocrinologists are a step further here because they look at different organ systems. But still, their concept of liver disease, I think at this time is not to the level where it could be. So there's been some talks about you need physicians to address metabolic health in a broader sense. And that's like a physician's administrative discussion. There's no global metabolist, if you'd like. And maybe she touches that topic.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to Monday again, recency effect, right? But if you remember the discussion we had on Monday about the Legend trial, Naeem talked about what a good idea it was to combine with an SGLT2. Mazen said, well, gee, if you did a GLP-1, you get more weight loss. And my immediate reaction is yes, but less effect on cardiovascular system metabolic. I mean, that tension on this podcast goes all the way to Donna Cryer looking Vlad Ratiu in the eye over video 6 months into the podcast and saying, if I'm dead, I'm dead. I don't care if it's my liver or my heart that kills me. But I think there is that tension around how much of NASH are we thinking about in a holistic metabolic sense versus how much do we pay lip service to that but really focus on the liver. And in that context, I think cardiology and nephrology might be really good places to go because that's where so much of metabolic disease plays out. So I'm delighted to hear that she's a cardiologist who's worked on preventive. That sounds fantastic.
It was a great addition to have a cardiologist there, and it'll be a very interesting session.
And then comment on that, I couldn't agree more. Organs don't exist in silos, and we need to start addressing the entire patient, not just one specialty. So I'm going to pose a question to everyone here. This is a big overarching ask. So micro and macro. The micro question is, what do you hope to get out of this session with an integrated approach between specialties, and how is that going to move the field forward?
It's a better question than the ones I asked, so thank you. You're supposed to finish that by saying brave one go first, because that one's going to take a little bit of courage.
Brave one go first.
Clearly, let me take a chop. I think we'll learn from this session about where we lose our patients because the journey is not well defined and most of them are lost. We'll learn that they have comorbidities, specifically cardiometabolic health is poor. We might be able to pick them up there. My hope is to treat liver disease, improve those outcomes, and maybe Oksana Trapkina in the end going to educate us on how physicians could be educated better to do a better job than we are at current state. But then if I knew all the answers about what they're going to talking about, I wouldn't have to go there. So I'm very excited to still attend and listen to their thoughts.
I suppose if I'm looking at it, I agree with Jörn on all of that. And I think there was a very good paper. There was a meta-analysis out earlier on this year by Livnat Alon that basically showed on the meta-analysis that fatty liver disease is a direct increasing risk of MIs, ischemic strokes, AFs and heart failure. Can we now ignore that data? We get our liver patients way too late, so they die. Yet they've been in cardiovascular endocrine medicine for 10, 15 years before we get hold of those patients. So anything we can do and any light that she can shed on how we can strengthen that learning and take it forward will be most valuable. So we shouldn't need now meta-analysis coming out to prove cardiac link as this one's done this year.
Rachel, there's my big ask and then there's my small comment. My small comment is, I've said this since virtually we started this podcast, they teach in business school that people do what's inspected, not what's expected. And one of the problems the liver has always had is that nobody knows how to measure fatty liver disease. And I think that there have been a bunch of issues around fatty liver disease, but that's been one of them. So that's my micro. My macro is that the way to appreciate the importance of fatty liver disease is to understand how many metabolic diseases and deaths it contributes to and how directly you can draw those links. Because the more you can draw those links and the more directly, the lower a standard I suspect you wind up having for proving things about the liver itself, because you know it's going to flow out in a bunch of different directions. So if we can draw those links, particularly if anybody can provide data that says, if you see this in the heart, the kidney, wherever, that's likely to be a liver issue or more likely to be a liver issue, so that we can start to broaden the context around exactly what this means. That would be fantastic. That might be completely a dream, but or a prayer. But however you want to look at it, I think that's where I'd love to see this go. Do you have an answer to that question, by the way, Rachel?
Yes. So for micro, I would love to see some strategies starting with if-then statements, in the sense where if a patient has cardiovascular disease, what's the likelihood of assuming that they also have fatty liver? And some studies, I know that there's been a lot of studies recently around this. So looking at what to do translationally from those studies to the next step. So that's what I hope to see just being discussed. And then for the macro, it's to take that a step further and to elucidate what actionable results can we take with that information. So those two things.
Rachel, might the through path for what you're talking about run through epigenetics?
Absolutely. And of course, I have a biased perspective as as we all do here from our certain lenses in our specific fields, but it's just an underexplored region of the human genome. It's previously been assessed in oncology, and it's starting to ripple into other specialties. So of course with NASH and fibrosis, but this also has implications on renal disease and in cardiovascular disease. So I definitely foresee an integrative epigenetic assessment going forward in these diverse spaces that need to come together.
Okay, great. So here's what I want to do. Unless someone has a preference, we've talked a bit about the rest of the morning session already. Jörn talked about that. Chris and Cyril and then Rachel talked about the HIV patients. I want to skip past the histopathology and digital pathology section and go to the basic science lecture that Scott Friedman has given, and then the FNIH section that follows that, and spend a couple of minutes on what we hope to see, what we believe we'll see, why we're excited about that. I'll start. If you listen to the last 35 minutes of this conversation, you wind up smack in the FNIH metabolic diseases discussion from 4 to 5. NASH, heart failure, beta cell, kidney, all in context. So I think that might be just a fascinating hour in pursuing the path, Rachel, that you just asked us about, that we hope we might go down in the course of this meeting. We might see a lot of the promise in that hour. It's just my sense.
What this specific section makes me think of, as I was speaking about a little bit earlier, was with patients with HIV, it begs the question of, are the same biomarkers, do they have the same clinical efficacy between these discrete patient populations? So for example, an individual with HIV with NASH and an individual with diabetes or obesity with NASH. So what I'm really interested to see from this study is, how does that translate between specialties and between patients of various etiologies? So that's one thing I'm interested to see what the implications of that are in biomarker development, in clinical trial design, because, if you look at a lot of the biomarker development strategies, you see that there's an overabundance of patients with diabetes and obesity, and not a good patient population of every other underlying cause. So I'm really interested to see of how this talk is going to translate into stratifying patient populations. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to taking out of this part of the session.
Let me add, I think it fuels the idea that we're pretty silent in the way we study the organs. The session starts with the Metabolic Steering Committee focusing on metabolic health. Okay, so this is not focused on a certain organ. It's about metabolic health, as it's important for the entire patient. And then biomarkers that could be used to do that. Then there are different diseases that are subsumized: liver, HFpEF, the beta cells, and kidney disease. And the interesting thing to me is, we're developing drugs in some indications. Some drugs might be more broadly addressing all of them. And an example could be a study that was published in the New England Journal on August 27th, a few days ago, the dapagliflozin study in HFpEF showing improved or preventing cardiovascular progression and heart failure. And that's a drug that's probably protective for liver disease too, and obviously has been developed for diabetes and the metabolism. So I think we're going to see an overarching theme of both drugs and organs, how they interact, and it's captured very well and nicely in that session.
So with one eye on the clock, why don't we keep moving? I'm going to jump through the industry symposia that start off Friday and the industry corner and go to disease biology and the lunchtime conversation.
I have a brief comment only because I'm really interested in the lipogenesis and lipotoxicity, given I'm writing this chapter and trying to do the pathogenesis in 700 to 900 words. I know they will use more, but I just want to learn a little bit more. Can we escape it? Because that might cut a section out. But yes, things like that are interesting me, particularly at the moment, in the biology, the endothelial cells in NASH. I never thought I'd heard myself say that as a nurse.
But you've now transcended nursing, right?
Absolutely.
Or as Serena Williams has put it this week, you've evolved.
Evolve, yes. However, that was not where my thoughts were when I was a senior nurse or a matron.
I'm really excited to learn more about microbiome. I think that's a subject where we've only, in fact, Rachel was one of the people who really got me focused on this several months ago, but I think we've only scratched the surface. And that's a bad pun to use when the following paper is about endothelial cells, but I think that's an accurate statement. The more we can hear about this, and I think is vitally important.
Yeah, I think that we're human-centric and human-focused. So it's interesting to think and start to extrapolate how we interact with our microbiome. I feel like a broken record sometimes, but we're 1 to 10 cells. One cell, for every one cell we have for humans, there's 10 cells of microbes that exist. So we're literally a living, breathing universe. universe of microbes. And when they are dysregulated, there is an impact on sleep, wellness, disease. And I'm interested to see this study and the implications that this talk will have.
We agree. It's interesting that you use the term human-centric that way, but I think it's really fascinating. Okay, other thoughts on this section?
Going back to what Rachel was saying there, I've just been reading some interesting stuff on amphotericin used in the gut. And now we used to use that in acute liver failure way back when I was thinking to protect patients, but now I had a little bit better insight and understanding. So yes, the more we know, the less we know in the end, isn't it, at the moment, about pathogenesis of how everything affects NAFLD and NASH, and that every single person could potentially have a different reason for getting it. So it's fascinating at any sphere, and I think that's a really interesting session.
Louise, as we move on, I'll simply comment that I've always preferred the phrase, the more we know, the more we have to learn. Because I don't think it's literally that we know less. It's that every time you walk through a door, you just see this increasingly vast, expansive knowledge that's out in front of you that you can't touch.
Absolutely.
That's just the glass half full way of expressing that particular sentence. All right, so then we go into the afternoon session, which I mentioned a bit, or parts of, and I guess Louise mentioned NASH Pass. Jörn, what do you see as the flashing opportunity for insight or integration, starting with Dr. Sanyal's lecture on NIT-based drug development, going on through the end of the clinical trial innovation section?
Clearly, I'd be expecting to hear from Arun how he sees NASH drug development in an NIT-based setting. You know, we've discussed a little bit on that. How frequently do you probe patients? How do you combine biomarkers? Which ones do you define as a primary endpoint? Is this going to be a surrogate biomarker like the FAST score or MEFIB, or is it going to be a true single biomarker to be able to assess the change? I mean, there's a lot of open questions, and I'm expecting a really thought-provoking and forward-looking scenario from him, because Arun oversees the field like no one else does, and that's going to be very interesting. Followed up by Frank Anania, who gives a very pragmatic regulatory approach and maybe bring us back to the current day, because he's going to highlight the data that the FDA requires to approve a drug based on that. So I think it's a good combo in that way. And in session 5, again, one thing that also resounded with me or struck with me, and Stephen has mentioned, is the talk by Yara Maryu from Mexico, because they're addressing the infrastructure to increase the clinical trials. They're calling it effectiveness, but reminds me of a discussion we had, is how can you effectively increase the recruitment of patients? Maybe we have to go to the patients, maybe we have to create different infrastructures to provide experimental treatment to patients that are not situated next to a center. So a very diverse session, I think, very visionary with regards to Arun's talk, and maybe onto the current statement or thinking of the FDA by Frank Anania, and then something, could we improve patient enrollment?
You know, you aren't listening to you. I'm remembering a comment that Naeem made, again, on this past week's episode. It kind of seems like we didn't set it up this way, but that episode teased this up better than I would have thought, about the idea that one of the things that makes NASH so different is that every other drug where we've looked at combination, every disease where we've looked at combination therapies, we've been working with monotherapies that were in market, proven out in hundreds of thousands or millions of patients. And as a result, before we thought about a combination therapy, we would know exactly what we were looking at down to the, he didn't say this, but down to the 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 patient level. Here, we're talking about combination therapies for drugs that have not yet been approved. Not that that's never happened before, pardon the double negative. HIV, hepatitis come to mind, but it's unusual and very unusual for an asymptomatic population with as many people in it as this has. So I will be fascinated to hear what the agency is looking at in practical terms to approve combinations for drugs that are not yet in market, or agents none of which are in market yet, and if that's even a possibility.
I just have one comment on this last session. I'm interested in the placebo arm project as to what that is, because we talk a lot about placebo and why placebo does so well, and whether or not that's going to give us information about what the placebo is in difference, and whether or not there's a theory as to what works, because we do discuss that bit a lot. But I think on the developing a global strategy for NASH, Danyok Young, that session interests me, because India is currently the only country that has a NAFLD strategy published at a governmental level, and they are not on the agenda. And it's not somebody from India who already has experience of how the political levers work to get a national strategy in. And they have a drug approved in India for NASH, although it's not FDA and EMA approved. So that is something that sort of stands out to me on that particular session on the global strategy.
It's a good point, Louise. And in that context, I'm delighted that Arun is co-chairing the session because I know he does a lot of work on that issue in India.
And in their defense, they had someone there from India last year who gave an insight. And I think changing topics and speakers, it might have been one way to just exchange that. The placebo arm project, I mean, it's interesting because if you do meta-analysis, you see placebo responses between 10 and 35% in these trials. And of course, that's difficult to be calculating with. And the Liver Forum is trying to address that. There's some other initiatives too. We heard from Nail and IT that's going to be addressing some of that. So I think there's a lot of data available. And it's important we explore that even beyond a single sponsor's study, pulling this data together, and the bigger consortium are in the right position to do so.
Thanks, Jörn. That's fantastic. I want to take Rachel's question. I want to broaden it and I want to throw it back at us. Okay. You asked the question about a session. I'm going to ask the question about a meeting. At a micro and a macro level, what insights or energy would you like to see come out of this event? Micro being something that's going to change shortly after people walk out of the meeting, and macro in terms of when you look back in 3 to 5 years and you say, this was the moment that started to shift. What would you hope it would be? Again, brave one, go first. And I try not to ask questions I can't answer, but I don't have an answer ready for this one immediately, so I can't go first.
Rachel got to go first 2 times. Now it's Louise or me, right? I think now I understood the question. Not sure I understood her question the first time. Now it's settled a little bit with me. I think in the macro, here I'm really interested in how the drug development is going to move away from histology, and we're going to learn a lot about how the organs are interacting in the metabolic health section, the FNIH section here. Arun's talk on future NIT use and FDA perspective. So I think as a clinician and principal investigator of clinical trials, that will be the most important aspect for me. At the micro level, I'm always thrilled to see the basic science sessions with Scott Friedman, the session Frank Tucker and Massimo Pinzani are chairing, a very micro, it's not micro aspects, but it's the basis of disease biology. And those are very interesting always to listen to. And our understanding of these mechanisms has the potential to transform the field, to identify new targets, both for drug development and biomarker development.
I'm going to jump in next because we're going to leave Rachel to the end on this one, given she posed this complex question. I suppose for me, the micro is the fact of getting the other disciplines round the table at a joint meeting so that we start to really tease out how do we get it into diabetes, how do we get cardiovascular, and we have specialists from those areas involved. And I suppose for the macro, it is combining that with the developing a global strategy for NASH, because we cannot do that unless we have all of the players around the table. I once used the phrase in the last couple of weeks that we don't try and repair a car without opening the bonnet to look at the engine, but we're trying to solve diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all of the other linked metabolic diseases without taking the lid off the liver. And we're not going to be able to do that. So for me, that's the macro. Can we now get everybody in and around as engineers looking at this engine? Because it's all part and parcel. The car doesn't work uniformly, neither do we. Person-centric.
Rachel, I'm going to go last.
So for me, the micro is I'm really interested to see about the questions across specialties. So essentially, what is the market research that physicians and clinicians alike need to be asking others in different specialties to drive the conversation forward? So that's the micro. And then the macro in 3 to 5 years from now is what are the smallest steps forward to construct that integrative approach? Just as Louise was just explaining, we need a global strategy. And I don't think that that's going to be done in silos. So the micro is these conversations across specialties during the meeting, and then the steps and the actual results from these conversations to move the field forward and to break down the silos.
That's great, Rachel. So let me suggest that I'm going to use the phrase global as a double entendre, right? There's a global where the world is the world, and that's important. And then there's the global that Rachel introduced us to, which is we think of it from the human body perspective. There's the global of our own bodies. The macro, to me, is both of those, which is we need to understand how we're going to address this in different parts of the world because the challenges vary. We also need to understand how we're going to address the whole body in the context of the liver. Not only picking up the bonnet, as you would say, Louise, here we talk about the hood, whatever you want to call it, lifting it up so you can see what's underneath, but also then understanding that all these pieces are connected, that when you blow out your engine, as we did on our car here last month, 3 other things wind up melting that you can't see until you've replaced it with a new engine. So that all these things are connected much more holistically within the human system and across the whole planet. My micros really in that context, if you take that context and you lay it up against specifically, I think, the Frankenania talk and that entire section. I'm hoping that companies and investigators will get a better sense as to what the most important and easiest links are they can start making now to get to push the combo forward, both halves of it. And with that, let me thank you guys for a fantastic 40 minutes. We will be back with the other half of the discussion, the NAFLD Summit discussion, shortly. And I want to thank everybody for your time. Looking forward to being part of a meeting in Paris together, all of us, whether in person or virtually. Okay. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So it's
and Jörn and Louise, thanks for disrupting our normal schedules.
Thanks.
See you, everybody.
Ciao, y'all. Bye-bye.
Next, Jeff Lazarus joins Roger to discuss his recent activities and identify some high points of the upcoming NAFLD Summit meeting.
So as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, our focus on NAFLD Summit will be a series of 2 or 3 one-on-one interviews with good friends of the podcast. First one being Jeff Lazarus. Jeff, how are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent, thanks. Jeff and I have just been catching up for the first time really since Barcelona in May, I guess it was, about our summers and his remarkably hectic pace and things he's been working on. So let's just dive in, kind of take a couple of minutes and tell our listeners and downloaders about what you've been up to this summer. Interested a little bit on COVID maybe, and then a little bit on anything you've been doing subsequent to Barcelona, issues of national clinical care pathways. Then we'll take about 20 minutes. We'll talk about this conference, and that's what we'll do. So your floor, my friend.
Sounds good. I mean, it's been quite a summer because on the one hand, it's been a quiet summer in many ways for COVID-19, mainly because the media hasn't been covering it. And of course, we've had great success with the vaccines and people getting boosted and fewer symptoms, fewer deaths. It's not been like the earlier waves, but there are still waves. So many of us feel like we're in the eye of the storm, not to always look about with stories of doom and danger, but we need to prepare for the autumn, at least in our hemisphere. That's really taken up a lot of my time. I tried to take time off. I started flying to Chicago for the NAFLD nomenclature conference, and then SAS Airlines went on strike, canceled my flights. There were almost no flights out of Europe. Everything filled up with everyone who lost their SAS flights. And at the last minute, thanks to support from AASLD, I made it to the conference, and we'll get into that conference, I guess, a little bit. But after that, took some family time, but mostly was working on a COVID-19 consensus statement. So this was similar to what we did with NAFLD, and we've talked about on the podcast. There we had 218 people agree on a series of statements and recommendations looking at NAFLD as a specific public health challenge. So it was a real landmark achievement to get everyone to start to recognize the public health challenges rather than really focusing on the clinical challenges that, of course, still remain. So for COVID-19, one of the biggest challenges of this pandemic is getting people to agree on what to do. So we brought together almost 400 people from 112 countries and territories, and we went through over 100 pages of recommendations from every source we could find, looked at what was evidence-based, and then looked for where we could get agreement so we could launch this proposal for key actions for governments to take across a range of areas, but also reporting the disagreement, because often when we published, whether it's in liver health or really any other condition, we tend to agree with our co-authors and we write our recommendations, and we might discuss a few things in our discussion, but we agree on our conclusions. But I would venture that when you get a very large number of people together, there's not 100% agreement on everything. That's what we showed in the NAFLD public health consensus statement, where there was a lot of very high levels of agreement, but importantly in this COVID-19 piece that will come out later this year, hopefully with a bang and a media presence so people can see also what the disagreement was and why and how do we overcome that, because there really shouldn't be any disagreement with the evidence-based recommendations. So my summer was a little bit of beach, much less travel, and a lot of writing and heavy lifting.
Interesting. So take a minute, because this is something people on this podcast will want to know about. A little bit about the nomenclature conference and how you felt about that and where that's going and what your involvement is right now and where that's headed as you see it.
Well, the nomenclature conference was a sort of a midway point where we've done 2 rounds of a Delphi process where, over 250 people selected by AASLD, EASL, Apostle, ALE, ELPA, GLI, LPI, and others. So representing leading organizations around the world, focusing on, do we need a new name? What will that name be? So it's not just changing the name. It's a nomenclature we need to understand is about the name or names, because there'll be subtypes, and the definitions. I was amazed by how well that meeting went. It was very engaging. There was an independent facilitator who really got people with their markers on posters, thinking, discussing, moving around tables, and discussing the pros and cons of a whole wide range of names. So we came out of the meeting feeling really invigorated that there had been an opportunity for everyone to participate from all of these leading organizations. And it's important to remember that individuals or even associations can make declarations of a new name, but we do need a global agreement on this. And even if we end up with that new name that's been circulating, it will have gone through a rigorous process, so we can then present it to WHO, to other associations, and say, behind these decisions, this was the process. So EASL and AASLD and ALE, the Latin American Association for the Study of the Liver, have released statements that are on all of these websites about the meeting that was on the 8th and 9th of July in Chicago. About 130 people participated, so around half of those in the consensus process, but really broad-based. Apostle sent people came from India, people were online in Australia, people came from near and far. It was chaired by Dr. Maru Ranella, who's in Chicago, and Dr. from ASLD, and Dr. Phil Newsome coming in from Birmingham in England. So they chaired the meeting, and we had various short talks, but then really just a lot of work around this. I'll just say that we agreed on really 6 principles. So this should be affirmative and non-stigmatizing. It should be accurate description of the condition. It should be adaptable, adoptable, applicable, and able. So, you can go onto the EASL, ASLD, or ALE or other websites and see this and what we mean by all of these A's and all of this terminology. But basically, we want to make sure that the consensus process is inclusive and transparent. And now we're going to expand to bring in a few more people from the Middle East and North Africa region at their request, as well as a few more people from the Asia Pacific region at the specific request of Apostle. And then we'll move into our 3rd round. And we hope at AASLD, the liver meeting in November, we can present this, because I'm finding that I think many people are finding that the discussions are getting a bit divisive. Different organizations pronouncing, comparing citations and so on. And that's not really the way forward. I mean, in the end, we all have to agree on what we're going to call this condition and then get on to the task at hand, which is raising awareness about it, diagnosing people, getting them into care, developing, and then eventually using the new therapeutics. So it's a very challenging issue because it affects everything from clinical endpoints to how we engage with our colleagues in other fields. If we walk in and we say, well, this is fatty liver disease, this is NAFLD, this is NAFLD, and they just look at us like a bunch of amateurs. So it's just, I think, terrific that ASLD, EASL, ALE, Apostle, and the patient groups are working together on this.
I've been struck by how much positive energy and also how much, I'm not going to say negative energy, but I'm going to say fraught emotion this topic raises. It's better. I have to tell you, the mix of positive energy to fraught is much, in the conversations I have with people, is much better in the aftermath of Chicago than it was before. I believe that meeting did a significant amount to create more consensus and a belief that folks were on the same mission, even if they viewed it from different perspectives. You wouldn't think if you were outside the profession that a name change would be such a intensive and emotional process, but obviously it is, for reasons that if you live in the profession, you do understand. Good for everybody who's involved in trying to steer this ship to some pretty turbulent seas to a harmonious landing, to mix my steerage metaphors. With that, why don't we shift over to NAFLD Summit? First of all, what role will you be playing? And then second, what are some of the presentations and sessions where you will not be presenting that you are particularly looking forward to attending? Let's first one first. So what are you going to be doing there? What will your role be?
Well, first, I'm very excited about the first session, less so that I'm presenting than actually what it's called, which is epidemiology, disease modifiers, and models of care. And I'm going to specifically talk about evolving models of care and, what the future is going to look like. So we've talked on this program before about the work we've done jointly around the world on understanding what models of care are best fit for purpose, the who, what, where, and how, making them multidisciplinary. So I'm going to get a chance to present this, obviously, to mostly clinicians and liver specialists. But this is where we're going to get to hammer home again the importance that everybody knows, but how do we really make this happen with multidisciplinary care? So I'm excited to see models of care there. I attend the INSHU conference, which is a network working with people who inject drugs and biohepatitis. And there we've had models of care on the agenda for many years. We even have an award for the best actual real model of care, not the best abstract, but the best models of care in practice, like mobile clinics and so on, multidisciplinary care in addiction centers. So I'm excited that models of care is high on the agenda in the first session, and I'll be at that. I look forward to subsequent sessions, particularly on non-invasive fibrosis markers, so the present and future. I mean, NITs is the way forward, and we've seen this again from our work earlier in viral hepatitis. As soon as we could get point of care or cheap tests, easy to use, non-invasive, in the case of viral hepatitis, dried blood spots, rapid antibody tests, using the Gene Expert for RNA confirmatory tests for hepatitis C, and so on, things really started to change. This will be an exciting session where we have, a whole discussion and panel around MITs. There'll be some sessions. There's a great session that looks like on new approaches to lifestyle modification. I want to know what the new approaches are going to be, because I've heard a lot about lifestyle modification. We're all trying to modify, and we know what to do, I think, in the field of fatty liver disease. So I'll look forward to hearing sort of what's new. They have some bullets around, nutrition and app specialists and exercise trainers and so on. It's always interesting to get updates on where we are with the clinical trials. Then there's a number of important clinical discussions that will be less maybe relevant for me as a non-prescriber, but I will fill my time during those sessions with a series of meetings with industry partners and leaders in the field, where we'll be talking about an upcoming meeting we're going to have at Wilton Park. This will be the third one. Wilton Park is a UK-based global think tank. They call them dialogues, and we're finally going to meet in person. We've been doing this online. That's where we had our NAFLD public health consensus statement meeting. It's where we did our models of care work. They're professional moderators. They bring people together to dialogue. So no death by PowerPoint, no traditional abstract-driven presentations, but we will have, based on the consensus statement, 7-8 areas of work where we're going to be looking at research priorities and the subsequent actions we need to contribute to ongoing and future efforts to kind of pull together as a global community and address things. So again, we've done this in other fields, and we did this in viral hepatitis some years ago, and it was incredibly useful. I mean, people can research in whatever they want, but this will give some guidance to where some of the big gaps are. So we'll be meeting for 2.5 days on the Wilton Park grounds in the UK, and to prepare for that, we have a whole series of meetings in Dublin with key stakeholders.
And that meeting is in October, if I recall correctly?
That meeting is 17th to 19th of October. It's one of the few meetings that's specifically not hybrid. This is about being in the room, and if you're not in the room, as they say in Hamilton, we'll bring the room to you afterwards, and we will engage. Everyone who's been involved in the previous consensus statement, both the current ongoing nomenclature work, but also the public health consensus statement, will all be invited to comment and be a part of that publication. But we need to sit really around that big table and hammer out our ideas. I know it's disappointed some people that they couldn't attend virtually, but this is really working in small groups, thinking together, walking and talking, and so on.
How many folks will be part of that meeting?
There'll be about 47, and that's specifically based on the maximum number of people who can stay there.
So when you say about 47, that's 47 plus minus 0, huh?
Well, some people might not show up. So
no, I got that part.
It won't be more than 47, but I assume it'll be pretty close to 47.
Up to 47.
And again, that's a very specific goal we have. So each of the working groups is being led by someone from one of the international associations, involved, again, representatives of patient advocacy groups. So it's a big effort to make sure this is understood as a global collaboration, and there'll be geographic and gender equity, and there'll also be other disciplines. So there'll be people from experts in the environment and sports medicine, as well as endocrinology, as you can imagine, from the world of Obesity Federation, Diabetes Federation, and largely liver specialists, of course.
I should tell you, one of the things I love about what you just said, I'd heard a little bit about this meeting previously from a couple of the attendees who asked why I wasn't going, and I said because I wasn't invited, and I don't think that's how Wilton Park works. And I also love about this agenda is the range of issues that people are taking into account as they start to think about NAFLD and fatty liver in general, and NASH, and whatever we're going to call it at the end of the day, as the emerging pandemic that it is. Because the liver is hidden behind so many other things for years, and because it's hard to measure fatty liver disease in a cost-effective and prognostic way on a patient-by-patient basis. FIB4 has been demonstrated to have some strengths in that area, but some weaknesses, and everything else tends to be a lot more expensive or hard to get your hands on. People haven't thought about this nearly as holistically as they are starting to now. So, for example, your comment about who will be at Wilton Park. I thought it was fascinating that at the session that you talk about, that opening session, the first talk is Zobert, you're talking about epidemiology, epidemiology. And the third talk is you talking about pathway models, but in the middle is Shira Zelversagi talking about nutrition, which is important, but not necessarily conventionally how people think about medicine. I'm going to be fascinated personally by the session at 5:30 on Friday afternoon titled How do Pharmacologic Treatments of Comorbidities Affect NAFLD? I think that's a great question, right? We're going to be talking about that in the third episode of our diabetes series and how the various ways that you can treat diabetes can have an impact on people's livers. But it's a much broader question than that.
I think what you mentioned about, there's Zubair speaking on epidemiology, Shira speaking on nutrition, me speaking on models of care is a real sea change. I was at this meeting many years ago. Like I said, as a non-prescriber, there wasn't a whole lot of much interest to me. And I think the field is understanding that to move forward, we need to broaden. So I think it's a great way to open the conference. And then everything that's usually there will be there with the state-of-the-art lectures, the updates on the clinical trials, and so on. But if we're not addressing this, that's why, there is some value to understanding that this is metabolic associated and engaging much more with our colleague. We can't keep going, whether it's even, we learned it early in HIV and biohepatitis, we can't keep going in fatty liver disease on our own. We need to be engaging with others. The challenge is how to get them to come to a conference or stay at a conference if there's very little on their topic. And there, having hybrid sessions is extremely important. And I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've learned that needs to happen in future. People won't travel necessarily for a 20-minute talk if it's a conference that in general they're not going to be interested in staying at.
So I didn't mean to forget John Dillon, who was the fourth paper in your opening session. Apologies to John, because I think the topic of case screening is really fascinating. I think it's going to be an interesting several months on the question of primary care level screening as it relates to fatty liver, using the broadest and most generic term. NICE is due to come out with their final ruling on use of FibroScan in primary care at the end of September. They put forth a preliminary ruling in February, and based on community feedback, decided to solicit requests for further data, hold it open another 6 months for people to weigh in from different perspectives. We'll be hearing about that. We had Ian on a couple of weeks ago talking about some work that he's doing and a poster he presented at EASL that I think we'll see more on, comparing different primary care screening strategies to ask which one was most cost effective. The conclusion he came to was that a method, I think that, I forget the term he uses because I didn't think this conversation was going to go to this place, as comprehensive, wound up being able to pick off 85% of what you could pick off in an idealized system, which isn't everybody. Fundamentally, it's if you have 500 people, the idealized and total comprehensive approach can get 90% of them. The approach he was talking about, which basically starts with FIB4 and some kind of prospective fibrosis test, all in stage 1, winds up achieving 85% of that cost effectively, as compared to some of the other approaches that may either hit those same kind of numbers for a lot more money or may have lower rates. But I believe we're going to start to see a lot more about primary care issues because obviously, and we talked about this in Barcelona, and you talked about this in Wilton Park in January, hepatology is going to get swamped by this.
I'm really, inspired a little bit by those discussions in Barcelona. Vincent Wang and I, along with a great group of colleagues, again, Shira Zelversagi and Ken Kuzi, Patricia Carriere, Eugene Wright, and Javier Crespo in Spain, just published in Liver International Management of NAFLD in Primary Care Settings, where we go through, the key issues you've just outlined. We need to set a focus on primary care. We can't overwhelm them, but we need to show them there's some simple tools they can use. Are they perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? I sincerely think so. And it also builds the knowledge and the understanding. So one thing is getting them to use these simple tests like a FIB4, and the other is simply raising awareness among them that if they're so focused on diabetes, if they're focused on weight loss for obesity, they need to realize that one motivator might be understanding the risks to the liver, and then also how to communicate about that, because the provider-patient communication is really challenging, and often the liver is left out in a discussion with someone on their obesity or on their diabetes. We ignore the liver. There's a focus from EASL going to WHO, a comment where, again, in the new technical guidance on non-communicable diseases, NAFLD and any version of it is not mentioned even a single time. I mean, that's just hard to believe. I spent 11 years at the World Health Organization. I know how it works, so I know this is possible, but it really should not be happening. We're not asking to be on the cover here, but we're asking that when you talk about non-communicable diseases, you mention one of the most prevalent ones in the world, which is fatty liver disease.
Is this the document where your memorable quote is the only time you see liver is in the word deliver?
Yes, and thank you for remembering that. That was the previous report, but we can have an encore with that sentence. Once again, we will deliver on diabetes care and cardiovascular disease care, and we'll deliver on cancer prevention and care, and all incredibly important. It's not a competition, but I don't think you're delivering on diabetes and cardiovascular disease if you're not addressing the liver as well. I think you're doing your patients more than a disservice. This is completely unethical to not be talking about what the impact is on the liver.
So, Jeff, 2 wrap-up questions. Okay, number 1, on this agenda, is there anything that people would not typically associate with your interests that you find particularly exciting? You mentioned non-invasive technologies, which isn't exactly right in your wheelhouse. Is there anything else in this session that you took a look at and said, gee, that's going to be interesting, just because you think so?
Personalized medicine. There's a lot of talk about what is this going to look like for NAFLD. I hope I can understand all of it, but I'm going to definitely go to that session because that's where the world is moving. So on the one hand, we're talking about people-centered health systems, but we're also talking about how to get more and more personalized, how to get more and more individualized. And I want to see, just like we talk about with the apps, and they can work one-on-one with machine learning and AI and so on. I want to see where we're going to go with personalized medicine. So that session 6 looks interesting.
Well, we should sit next to each other because it will be the blind leading the lame in the hall. Maybe between the two of us, we'll be able to figure out something about what's going on there. Because I agree, I think that's fascinating, and it's not something I understand all that well. Okay, one more question, actually commitment, which is after the Wilton Park session, I'd love to have you back on second half of October to talk about that meeting and what came out of it. Like I say, I know 2 people who are attending who've already told me how excited they are about it and said, why don't you hook onto it? To which I said, well, it doesn't work that way. But I would love in the aftermath for you to come on and talk a little bit about what came out of that event as early afterwards as you feel comfortable doing so. Maybe the following week or maybe whenever.
That sounds great. Probably a few weeks after so we can digest it and action some of those points. But I'll be happy to share. There's no secrets happening at Wilton Park. At our meeting, Wilton Park is famous for lots of secrets. It started in 1946 as a place to speak in confidence with the so-called Chatham House rules, no attribution, and so on. That won't be the case here. We're using this mainly for their convening and organizing and sharing skills rather than looking for a secretive event. So we'll be happy to share what's transpiring there and how we can involve as many people as possible to make it a truly global, set of research and action priorities. We're going to want as many people involved as possible. And like I said at the beginning, for COVID, we had 386 people involved in 3 rounds for over 8 months. So we're confident with the tools and the team that we can involve a large number of people and that they can all fairly engage. And we have a great group of people, leading the process, representing all of the different professional societies.
So fantastic. I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks for joining today. I look forward to seeing you in Dublin in a couple of weeks. And
looking forward to seeing you. Thanks for having me back.
Bye-bye.
And now for the Season 3, Episode 44 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. The war goes on.
The CME episode on NITs and Rising Tide series are attracting growing interest.
Okay, we have the CME episode on NITs and the first 2 episodes of Rising Tide, our series on diabetes and fatty liver disease, up in real time on our website now. We're recording our 3rd episode of Rising Tide later this week and planning to release it next Wednesday, the 14th. Come sign into the CME program on NITs for a fantastic discussion and to experience Nudge CME for yourself. Please be aware that you need to sign in personally to enter either session.
The meeting load and accompanying travel are complicating our recording schedules, but we've got it covered.
For different reasons, neither Louise nor I turn out to be able to attend Paris NASH in person this week. We are covering it virtually, and next Monday night, Jörn and I will be in studio with a guest or 2 to discuss the conference. As we mentioned last week, coverage for the NAFLD Summit's a little unique. Louise will not be there, Jörn will not be there. We will record the bulk of our review episode Saturday afternoon in Dublin, right after the conference closes down. Nazim Noureddin will play the role of experienced KOL co-host, and we will be joined by 2 esteemed European key opinion leaders that we'll be having on our podcast for the first time. Very excited about both of them, Sven Frank and Hannes Hagström. Louise and I will do a wrap-up on Monday evening that will be part of what gets released on the 21st, and the following week we'll be back to a more or less normal schedule until the end of the year.
We haven't discussed downloads in a while.
Downloads have remained strong, not quite at the 2,000 per week level, but close, and we expect them to pick up again in the next few weeks based on the quality of the content from these two conferences, the nice primary care discussion on FibroScan, and some of the other sessions we're putting out this fall on drug development, lifestyle, and NITs, plus, of course, ASLD, and perhaps another meeting or two. Our episode from the vault this week is one of the conversations from last year's Paris NASH, not the one that attracted the 1,500 downloads, which we already run recently, but one of the other two. I hope you enjoy it. And with that, I'm off. Thanks to the crew, Jake, Magic Mike, Eric, Steve, for working through a somewhat challenging schedule over this past week and the next couple of weeks with me. And as always, and most importantly, thanks to all of you for making this such a worthwhile labor to pursue. We'll be back next week with the Paris NASH review. And until then, stay safe, surf on. I'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.